I'll try not to repeat things, a lot of which I agree with that has already been said either by Jack or Marcus. I do think one thing that we have to bear in mind about this first meeting between a Soviet leader and an American president for years and years and years, that it was the first meeting, and that the two of them were unknown quantities. They were reliant on briefing papers that didn't tell them as much as they needed to know. And they were also unknown quantities in their own countries. Their own publics weren't quite so sure about what Gorbachev was up to or what Reagan was up to as we now know, because we lived through the history. But a third aspect of this is equally important, it seems to me. Neither of the two principals knew what they were up to. Neither of them had yet settled on the full program of objectives that they were to attach themselves to by the end of the 1980s. Gorbachev had no idea what perestroika would lead to. If in fact he'd known what it would lead to, he might not have actually continued with it. Reagan didn't have, as Roderick Braithwaite said this morning quite rightly, he didn't have an agenda for totally ending the Cold War. These things happened. But so what we're seeing at Geneva is the meeting of two unknown quantities, the two great principles who are unknown in three dimensions, both to themselves individually, to their own publics, and to the other side. So that's why the fact that they could get together, and if they didn't agree on any kind of arms control specificity, they could at least agree to hope. They could agree to meet again. They could agree that they could talk to each other. And that's why that Geneva conference, it seems to me, is so important. The two men also started much more than ever before to trust their own personal judgments. It's certainly the case with Gorbachev that he repeatedly says what useless information he got from the KGB and how much he had to trust his own judgment. He says this repeatedly in 87 and 88, and I'm sure you all know what George Shultz's opinion was of the CIA analyses in 87 and 88. When Gates took over the CIA, he pulled Gates in and said, look, this just can't go on like this. We've got to have analysis from you people, not policy preferences. So on both sides, the two leaders are becoming more individually self-reliant than they had been previously. And furthermore, when they returned home from Geneva, both of them were greeted with acclaim by their respective publics. And this was an important aspect, an important consequence of the Geneva conference, that both of them could therefore slip their political minders' influence over them. Reagan did not have to worry quite so much as he had to before about his conservative constituency. Likewise, Gorbachev could more easily ignore his conservative constituency. They were freer after Geneva than they had been before. The practical next step didn't come from Washington, but it came from Moscow, which was the January заявление, the declaration of Gorbachev about his wish for a staged pathway towards total nuclear disarmament. So the conclusions he drew from Geneva was that there had to be a practical pathway specified and agreed on both sides towards total nuclear disarmament. And when the details of this were revealed, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of External Affairs, was horrified because it became apparent that the details themselves were in line with the program put forward by the General Staff. And so there was a huge flurry of dispute in Moscow, resulting in a victory for the General Staff and the endorsement of the post-Geneva proposals from the General Staff being endorsed by Gorbachev. And many in the Foreign Ministry, and I have to say, reading Anatoly Adamyshin's diaries are just so useful to an understanding of this period. Anatoly Adamyshin's diaries are a great historical treasure. So are Roderick Braithwaite's, so are the personal papers of the man sitting next to me, Jack Matlock. These are so much more immediate than memoirs can ever be. You still have to treat the diarist with handle the diaries with rubber gloves, because they can mislead you. They can explode in your hands, but they are one of the great ways forward for historians and political scientists, I think. The disappointment of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs radicals in this astonishing proposal for total nuclear disarmament was understandable, because the General Staff had front-loaded the proposal so as to benefit the USSR at the cost of the USA. They were therefore a military lobby's trick. However, even in the short run, Gorbachev, I think, played a very, very clever political game, because he had at last tied the General Staff into agreeing to total nuclear disarmament and making it a practical proposition to come about by the year 2000, so that he bound the General Staff in. There was time and again when Akhrameyev had to accept that he had been cornered by Gorbachev. So in the longer run, the disappointment of Shevardnadze was to prove to be illusory, and the winner, Gorbachev himself. The problem was that this great consequence of Geneva was not seen that way in Washington. The front-loading of that declaration was depicted by both Weinberger and Casey as evidence that this new, apparently radical General Secretary was just as bad as his predecessors, was not to be trusted whatsoever. And even Schultz went to the Soviet embassy and complained that he hadn't been given prior warning of this заявление. And if you want trust, shouldn't you really start talking in advance of making PR gestures on this global stage, such as Gorbachev had done? So the short-term result of the declaration was to create a further dispute inside the American administration. And the spirit of November was, to some extent, cast out of the window by this extraordinary initiative of Gorbachev. Gorbachev, throughout the rest of the year, pushed the idea that the Soviet Union was putting forward a total package. The Americans had to take it or leave it. And the Americans simply said, if you want progress, you have to go by step-by-step approaches. This simply won't do. But the pressures on Gorbachev, pressures that had existed before 1985, we have this impression somehow that the Politburo was full of dunderheads before Gorbachev came to power. It endlessly discussed religious problems, social problems, political problems, ideological problems, international relations problems. What it didn't do, having diagnosed some of those problems to some extent, was agree on a cure. Gorbachev came forward with something of a cure. Why did he get away with it? I would say one of the reasons is that the crisis had grown so acute. That was why he was given his head in 85. He wasn't some great magician. He was a very, very charismatic and adept leader, but he wasn't a magician. The other reason, which hardly ever figures prominently enough in the accounts of the time, a lot of the accounts written in the 80s by political scientists were extremely good, but the fundamental problem of the crash in the world price of oil and gas, that was really absolutely terrifying to the whole of the Politburo. So that much as he might have wanted to continue with this whole package idea of changing international relations, Gorbachev was actually playing with a very, very weak hand all through 1986. 85 to 86, the oil price just falls through the floor. So he goes to Reykjavik in October, and they get so close to signing a deal, except that Gorbachev, partly because he misplaces his definition of what he means by SDI, partly because Reagan doesn't fully understand quite what the Soviet side is saying. The idea of a whole package or none wrecks the summit. Schultz goes back and goes round all of the TV studios and says, nevertheless, we got so far. We agreed on so many details of disarmament, on so many numerical questions that have been bothering us about missile reduction, that we should regard this as progress. But there's another of those great battles inside the American administration with Weinberger going hammer and tongs at Schultz, and Gorbachev insisting on sticking to his idea that it's a whole package or nothing. And here's an irony of history, that when Shevardnadze badgers him to alter his attitude, to accept a piecemeal approach to the elimination of nuclear weaponry in the world, his ally is none other than Gromyko. And at the February 1987 Politburo session, Gromyko and Shevardnadze, in a most unusual alliance, defeat Gorbachev. His first big defeat inside the Politburo. And the way is opened to the signature of agreements between the Reagan administration and the Gorbachev administration, really for the first time, practical agreements at last. So all of that means that the spirit of November has triumphed over the spirit of January. The Geneva ideas that the Americans brought to the table in November 1985 triumph over those of January 1986 as enunciated by Gorbachev. And from that point on, an astonishing range of agreements are signed, not only on nuclear missiles, but also on Africa, on Asia, Soviet policy in Asia, on China, even on Cuba, on the rights of Soviet citizens to travel abroad, on the jamming of TV and radio broadcasting, on political prisoners. All of this takes place in an astonishingly fast um, basis in 87 and 88. I mean, it made us all giddy at the time what was happening. And as has been said just a few moments ago, one of the things that the Americans very wisely did not do was crow. And they could have crowed about Eastern Europe in 1989, but Bush didn't crow. So the Americans had the subtlety in their diplomacy and in their political rulership to win victories or insist on changes, but not rub the Russians or the Soviets' leadership's nose in the dust. That, I think, is one of the reasons why 1989 into 1990 turned out in the way it did. The underpinning to all of this is that the Soviet leadership's bargaining hand, weak as it was in 1986 because of the oil, but also because of the long-term effects of the American technological embargo that had lasted since the 1940s, Gorbachev always had a very weak bargaining hand. But at some point, in any one of these years, 86, 87, 88, 89, or 90, it could have gone the other way. Gorbachev could have been overthrown. He managed to stay on in power. Things could have turned out differently. History isn't a preordained pattern and sequence of events. Individual actors as well as underlying factors really do matter.